Well, we've come to the last two lessons in our series, and I appreciate again the invitation to be here to work with you in this effort. I appreciate the format that you've set up. I think this has been very helpful for us to be able to study, to learn, and to retain these things as we have gone through them. We have come to the, as I said, the last two lessons as we're looking at the subject of church discipline. And we have already covered questions that have to do with what is church discipline. We've realized it's a very broad thing. It involves not just a withdrawal of ourselves from someone, but church discipline includes all of the teaching and the encouraging, the exhortation that takes place. It's all of the processes or means by which a church trains and educates its members to walk in the light. And much like in a family, discipline of children is training, it's example, it's encouragement, but it's also punitive at times. And that's what we find as we look through these New Testament scriptures. We saw who should receive corrective discipline: those who are guilty of sinning against a brother, those who practice the works of the flesh, false teachers and all who cause division, elders who continue in sin, and in 2 Thessalonians 3, simply all who walk disorderly. And that word disorderly, ataktos, is a word that means insubmissive, someone who is insubordinate, somebody that is unwilling to be ruled by the rule of Christ, the gospel. And so we also looked at who is responsible for taking action. We saw the responsibility of each individual Christian. We see the responsibility of the elders who will give an account for the souls of those that they oversee. And we saw the responsibility of the church. We saw that the way it's to be carried out is first to determine the certainty of guilt or innocence, to warn the disorderly, to make sure that there's sincere, diligent, long-suffering effort to restore them, and if they refuse to repent, the last measure is to withdraw ourselves from them. So that brings us then to one of the last topics that we're going to be looking at here, and that is, what is the responsibility that we have toward family members? What about when a family member has been withdrawn from, and specifically, are family members required to withdraw from one another? As I may have mentioned in this series, this was the issue that prompted my study of church discipline. I felt like I knew what the Bible taught about church discipline, but I was dealing with a situation. It was actually with Jennifer, and it was before we were married, my wife, before we were married, that she was in a situation in her own family where there was a family member that had been withdrawn from or marked by the church, and she was convicted that she was supposed to withdraw herself from this family member, but there were a lot of Christians that were telling her, oh, no, not family members. No, you need to understand your relationship here. You've got a special relationship. This is a family member. And it wasn't just other members of the church. There were preachers that were saying these things. There were elders in churches that were saying the same things, that no, your family members are not to withdraw. And so as she and I were discussing this, and I had always been of the conviction that it was no different for family than it was for any other member of the church, but it challenged what I had always believed. And I began looking for material on the subject, as I pointed out in the first study that we made this week, and I found just very brief cursory studies of church discipline, one lesson or a very brief tract. And none of them dealt with the subject of family members' responsibility to one another where church discipline has been practiced. And as I told you, the lion's share of the material that I've been presenting this week was gleaned from some material that Brother Ed Dye put together. He preached for many years in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He's since passed away, but he did a tremendous job in a very thorough study of church discipline and helped me have a broader understanding of it. But even in that study, there was nothing mentioned about the role and the responsibility of family members. Now, maybe that's because some of these brethren that put this material together just assumed that brethren would understand that this is a responsibility of every member. I don't know. But there was no answering the arguments that I found that were made saying, well, this is a special relationship and therefore family members are not to withdraw from one another. So I set out then in just a study of God's Word and what is this relationship? What is this special relationship we're being told? And is it one that prohibits church discipline? And therefore that became obviously a very big part of this series and one that I think is very important that we consider. Now, as we're looking at this subject, one of the first things that I would suggest to you that we need to understand is that when we're talking about church discipline, as we talked about last night, we're talking about action that a local church takes toward a member of that particular congregation. A local church does not have the authority to take action toward necessarily a member of some other congregation. It is within a local church. Now, having said that, let me say that a local church does have a right to say, we're not going to extend fellowship to this man because he teaches error. Even if that man is not a member of this local church, a congregation can make a decision, or the elders of a church can make a decision, we're not going to extend fellowship to this particular gospel preacher because he is a false teacher. But that's not necessarily equivalent to what's done when we were talking about an individual going to them and to the church, and if he will not hear them, that's a process that is taken with a member of the church. So we're talking about this issue of church discipline and one who has been withdrawn from by the church. What we've got to realize is, what we noticed last night is that Jesus said in Matthew 18 and verses 15 through 17 that it is to be told to the church, if he will not hear the church, let him be to you as a heathen and a tax collector. It is the church's responsibility to withdraw individually, obviously. Sometimes the word church is used distributively. Individually, we withdraw ourselves from that particular person. So the question then is, when we're talking about church discipline, the word church is a collective word. It involves every member. For instance, in Acts chapter 20 and in verse 28, Paul told the elders at Ephesus to shepherd the church of God. And when he was talking about shepherding the church, he was talking about all the flock. Notice it there in verse 28. He uses the phrase all the flock and the church synonymous with one another. When he talks about the flock and he talks about a shepherd shepherding something, he's talking about the shepherd shepherding the flock. The flock is the church, and what portion of that flock is to be shepherded? All of the flock. So when we're talking about the church, it includes every member. And as a matter of fact, when we're talking about this, I would just ask this question. All are included unless they are specifically excluded. You know, in Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 20, you remember that children are commanded to obey their parents in all things. Remember that? Obey your parents in all things. But in Ephesians chapter 6 and verses 1 through 2, there's a qualification that is there. That is to obey their parents in the Lord. So what that's telling us is that children are to obey their parents in all things, provided that it's in the Lord. There are some things that are excluded from their obedience, and that would be if the parents were telling that child to do something that is a transgression of God's will. So there's something that's excluded. So that's what we need to look for. If the church is commanded to withdraw, but there are some members of the church that are not to withdraw, my question is, where are they excluded? When the elders are told to have oversight over all the flock, are evangelists excluded from that? Do the elders have oversight over the evangelist? Or is the evangelist kind of a lone wolf? He does his own thing. No, that evangelist, provided he's a member of that local church, I'm not a member of this church, but where I'm a member of the church, there's accountability there. The elders have that oversight. What about the deacons of a local church? Are they excluded from the oversight of the elders? No. They have oversight over all the flock, and there is no exception to that within that local church. So this is just an example of how we have a word that is comprehensive. It's a collective word, and when it's a collective word, everything within the church is included unless it's specifically excluded, just like children obeying their parents. And so what we see then is in Matthew chapter 18, in Matthew chapter 18 and in verse 17, the church is commanded to withdraw. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and in verse 4, Notice there in 1 Corinthians 5 and in verse 4, he says, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when you're gathered together, along with my Spirit, deliver such a one to Satan. And in verse 13 of chapter 5, those who are outside, God judges, therefore put away from yourselves that evil person. This is not dealing with people that are outside the church, but he's telling the congregation, this is your responsibility. And so I want to ask you this question. Are evangelists excluded from that command to withdraw? Is everyone expected to withdraw from that particular person, or are evangelists excluded? Because an evangelist has somewhat of a special relationship with the members there. What about elders? Are they excluded? Do they not have to withdraw because they have a special relationship with the members there? And what about the deacons? What about the family members? My point is that if we're going to say that family members are excluded because they have a special relationship, well, I know a lot of people that have special relationships within a local church, but that does not by necessity exclude them from church discipline, unless the Scriptures have in some way, by a command, a direct statement, an approved example, or a necessary implication, excluded them from that action of withdrawing oneself. And there's not a Scripture that would exclude any of them. However, there is one circumstance that I do believe the Scriptures exclude from a withdrawal of oneself by necessary inference. And that is the relationship of a husband and of a wife. I believe it's specifically excluded by necessary inference because in Matthew chapter 5, I want you to notice with me there, in Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 32, he says, I say to you that whoever divorces or puts away his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. This idea of divorce is an idea of putting away, and I'm not saying that it's the same word as withdrawal, but it is the same idea. It is to put one away, and the command that we have to withdraw is to avoid, to turn away, to withdraw. All of these are the idea of putting someone away from us or putting ourselves away from them. And the Bible is telling us here there is no reason, no authority for that unless that person's mate has committed sexual immorality, porneia, fornication. In Matthew chapter 19, remember that the Pharisees came to Jesus testing him saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce? There's that idea again of putting away, to divorce his wife for just any reason? Jesus' answer in verse 9 was only with the exception of sexual immorality. Not because that person's been withdrawn from by a local church. And furthermore, when we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I want you to remember here the responsibility that inheres in marriage, in the marriage relationship. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, concerning the things you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, verse 2, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. I want you to notice particularly here in verse 3 through 5. Let the husband render to the wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to the husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. That responsibility, the sexual relationship, that sexual intimacy between a husband and a wife is a debt that each mate owes to the other person. That word deprive is talking about a debt that is owed. That I don't have authority over my body, but my wife does. She doesn't have authority over her body, but I do. Now that's not talking about anything abusive. Certainly a husband is to dwell with his wife with understanding. That's a whole other topic. But what I want us to see, and I think we understand, is that within the marriage relationship, there is a bond and a fellowship, a participation that is referred to as one flesh, an intimacy that is beyond any other human relationship that we have on this earth. And he says that there is never a time that is to be unendingly cut off. And so how, pray tell, could a person practice a withdrawing of oneself and not be going against that very clear command in what we see in Matthew 5 and in verse 32? You could not. That exception, this is the exception here. It is within this particular relationship. And I've been told about a husband and a wife. The husband had been withdrawn from, and so the wife was very conscientious, and she still prepared his meals, and she would bring him his meals, but she wouldn't eat with him. And I really respect and I appreciate her conscientiousness. But I'm going to tell you, if she doesn't eat with him, but she's fulfilling 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5, I don't see the point. And if she's not, I believe that that's sinful. That is a command. This is a relationship that differs. And as he goes through 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's explaining that God has joined together the husband and the wife regardless of what their faith is, regardless of their relationship with the Lord. In 1 Peter chapter 3, he addresses that a difference and that difficulty of a wife married to a husband that is disobedient to God, and possibly even harsh based upon the context. So what I'm wanting us to see is that the idea of withdrawing oneself from another person to avoid them, not to have participation with them, it is not simply fulfilled by not eating a meal with them. What a husband and a wife have together could not be had with one another, and this idea of withdrawing oneself take place. And that's something that's commanded, and there's no exception given other than sexual immorality on the part of one of those parties, and then they are put away in that particular case. And so then if there is a put away mate for sexual immorality, and the church has withdrawn from that person, then yes, that withdrawal is going to happen there. They're no longer in that bond of marriage. That woman or the innocent party is no longer bound to that person in that particular way. So I want us to understand that, yes, the Bible does talk about a special relationship. It does. And it is in this particular sense that I believe that we see this in this relationship. You know, in 1 Corinthians 5, I want to remind you, we looked at this earlier. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he tells us in verse 10 that if we practice church discipline with everyone in the world, we would have to go out of the world. So what does that say about church discipline being practiced with between two married people? Let's say a wife to her husband or a husband to his wife. He says, if we did this with everyone, we'd have to go out of the world. That's how severe it is. There's no way you could maintain that relationship and be scripturally doing what God requires that we do. Now, I do want to emphasize that if a mate is withdrawn from by the church, while the innocent mate, or the one who's not been withdrawn from, is not required to withdraw themselves from that person and not to keep company with them, they do have the responsibility to make every effort to restore outside of that. They need to be using every opportunity they have. And that's what 1 Peter 3 is talking about when he talks about a godly woman still being in submission and being respectful to her husband, and knowing that by her godliness and her conduct, even without a word, her husband may be won by that. So let us never forget that. And ladies, a husband who's been withdrawn from is not a license for you to step out of the role of submission and to all of a sudden become very bitter and sharp and disrespectful to your husband because now he's been withdrawn from. That's not what withdrawal is. As a matter of fact, withdrawing from someone has nothing to do with being bitter or sharp or disrespectful. I don't care what relationship we have, that's ungodly. And that is not authorized or licensed when we practice church discipline. So remember, in a marriage relationship, really nothing changes other than we're trying to restore that person. And I would also say, be very conscientious, as 1 Timothy 5 and verse 22 says, do not share in other people's sins. So while you would not withdraw yourself from that person and keep no company with them, you also need to be very conscientious that you do not become a partaker in their evil deeds. I know that there's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of very specific situations there that would have to be judged based on each one's merit, the situation, the circumstance. And those are questions that's why we need elders. That's why we need wise, older, wiser, mature Christians to ask, what do I do in this situation? What do I do in this situation? But in general, this relationship is excluded. But what about the relationship of a parent to a child? An extremely close and difficult relationship in a situation like this. What are parents to do? Well, many people say, well, that's different. A child sustained a special relationship. Well, let's look at this relationship. First of all, we need to ask the question, are they members of the church? If this child is a member of the church and the parent and that child has been withdrawn from, well, then they're included. They're included. And if the parent is a member of the church, they certainly have that responsibility to submit to that decision of the church. They're included. But someone says, well, they're specifically excluded. Well, is there a command to exclude parents from this? There's no scripture with a command. There's no approved example where someone was withdrawn from, but the parents were excluded. We have in 1 Corinthians 5 a member of the church that had his father's wife. There's no talk about his father not withdrawing from him. The congregation did withdraw from him and he was restored. But is there a necessary inference? I find none, but someone says, yes, there is a necessary inference. It's based upon special relationship. So let's look at the parent's relationship to a child. Let's examine and see what is the special relationship that would prohibit a parent withdrawing from a child. Well, what is that relationship? First of all, we see the relationship of a mother to her children. Her relationship, according to Titus chapter 2, notice it with me there in verses 4 through 5. The older women are to teach the younger women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers or home managers. What is a mother's relationship to her children? To love her children and to oversee or to manage those particular children who are in the home. What's a father's relationship? Well, based upon Ephesians chapter 6 and in verse 4, he is to bring up or train his children, bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in verse 8, if a man will not provide for his own, and especially those of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A father's responsibility is clearly to love his children. He is to have that agape love for all men, but definitely for his children. He is to discipline or to train them, and he's to provide for them. This is the special relationship. And you have a relationship with your child that I don't have. Now, I'm to love all men. I'm to love as God has loved. But I don't have the relationship or the responsibility to discipline your children the way that you do. Not within the home. I don't have the relationship to provide for your children the way that you do. And my wife does not have the relationship and the responsibility to love your children and to manage your home. So you do have a special relationship with your children in that particular way. But you know what? That's the same relationship that parents have had with children since the beginning of time. We go back to the law of Moses. We go back to the patriarchal age. This is the relationship between parents and children that God has commanded from the beginning. But you know, when we look in Deuteronomy chapter 21, turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 21, and I want you to notice what the law says about parents there. In Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verses 18 through 21, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. What I want you to notice is parents have always sustained that relationship, and yet that did not prohibit or prevent parents from disciplining their children under the old law. And this was a whole lot more extreme. This did not mean that the parents didn't love their child. This didn't mean that the parents weren't training. This didn't mean that the parents weren't managing their home. This didn't mean that the father wasn't providing. It simply meant that it was the last measure. And it was done to keep the camp or the nation pure. No, we see that the special relationship that parents have to children, it does not prohibit discipline. Certainly didn't under the Old Testament, and there's not one stitch of Scripture that would indicate that something would be different under the New Testament covenant or law. Well, what about a child who is not living at home? What about a child who's not... This is a child who has grown, they've moved out, possibly married, maybe even have their own children. They're an adult. What about a child who is not living at home? Well, I want to ask you, what relationship would prohibit a withdrawal of social interaction? I mean, there's not still that same relationship or responsibility of a father to discipline the way that discipline occurs before. You know, when a man and a woman are married, God said that they are to leave father and mother. That's one of the things that they leave. I be honest with you, before my dad passed away, I still wasn't completely sure he wouldn't whip me if he needed to, you know. I'm not sure that he understood that leave thing, you know. But in all seriousness, there are relationships that we leave when we leave the home, and especially when a marriage takes place. And so the relationship that is sustained that parents have with their children is that familial love. It is that tremendous love. And no doubt, parents are still training their children by example. They're still training in a whole lot of ways, but they don't have that same authority over their children. So what relationship would prohibit a withdrawal of their social interaction? That's what we're talking about. That you're not going to get together and have watermelon and you know, a picnic, and you're not going to go to the football game together and hang out, go out to eat, go on a hunting trip together. What relationship between a parent and a child would prohibit that? In other words, if you're not doing that anymore, in what area is a parent sinning, and what are they failing to do in that particular way? And I want to suggest to you, not one thing at all. Can we love someone and still withdraw from them? Of course we can. That's the whole motivation for church discipline, is our love for their soul. So if the parent's relationship with that child is to love them, withdrawing themselves from that child who doesn't live at home is certainly not going to mean that they don't love them anymore. I want you to think about another thing. What if the parents or the child were to take a job in Germany and move away for an extended period of time? And based upon economy or maybe a pandemic or whatever occurs, there is no social interaction. They're not able to be with one another. They're not able to go and eat with one another. They're not able to go shopping with one another or to entertainment or recreation with one another. And this goes on for years. Is that sinful? Is it sinful for parents to move to a location where they're not going to be able to have that social interaction with their kids? No. Is it sinful for a kid to move overseas where they're not going to have that social interaction with their parents? Absolutely not. We are not commanded to have that in that relationship. Now, I understand that we're to be hospitable, and so certainly if we were living here, we would have that need. But my point is that there are circumstances, even with a child who's not withdrawn from, that we could essentially limit the same interaction and not be sinning. So don't tell me that withdrawing from a child is doing something that is sinful or is hindering that relationship. What about a child who's still living at home? They are still dependent upon their parents. Well, here's the thing. If that child is too young to live alone, and it may be that that child is grown and they're adult and they're living at home, you don't need to be having that relationship with them and enabling their sin, providing for them, giving them that soft place to land and a place to live while they're living ungodly. If that child is old enough to live on their own, well then that's where they need to be. They don't need that soft place. But we're talking about a child who's still dependent. Let's say a child who's 13 or 14 years old. They've obeyed the gospel, and They are sinning and they've bowed their neck and they're not going to stop. And the elders are involved, the church is involved. What are we supposed to do there? Well, let me just say that if a child is too young to live alone, then they're young enough to be corrected. They're young enough to be corrected. I mean, we need to go back to some passages like Proverbs 22 and verse 15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. Proverbs 23 in verses 13 through 14. In Proverbs 23 and verses 13 through 14, do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. Now, this is in a completely different realm. This is family and family discipline and family leadership, and I think that's something that you're about to start a series and study on. And I will tell you, brethren, this is sorely needed, as much as this study on church discipline. I am absolutely astounded at how many young couples within the church do not have a clue of how to train their children and bring them into submission, or they're too lazy to do it. And I'm a little bit worried to find out which one it is. And it is hindering our evangelistic effort when people see the ungodliness of insubmissive children within a congregation that is commonplace out in the world, and it shouldn't be here. And again, this is one of these failures where older women are to teach the younger women, where the older men are to teach the younger men. I know you say, well, they don't want to hear it these days. A lot of people don't want to hear what I preach. Bless your heart. I mean, we still got a responsibility to tell people the truth. And these poor kids, it breaks my heart. You know, you see a spoiled, rotten kid, the inclination is to be upset with that kid. Don't be upset with a kid. You know, as one guy said, there are no bad kids, there's bad parents. These kids are merely a product of the training or the lack thereof. And what we need to do is we need to be teaching how to accomplish that. And this really is a big part of the problem. And when parents are not training, when they are not providing consequences for their children, usually if that child stays it becomes a Christian, in many cases that child is going to be a church discipline problem because they've never been trained in this area to learn self-control. But yes, if that parent is not bringing that child into submission, then that parent might need to be dealt with by the church. They at least need to be going to older and wiser members to find out how that needs to take place. So that is a family issue if that child is still living at home. And that's not usually the issue that we're dealing with. But what about a child in regard to their parent? Let's say a child's parent is doing this. Let me also say on that last point, you know, in Proverbs 13 and verse 24, the passage that we're probably most familiar with, the Bible says, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. So parents, if you won't restrain that child, then you are guilty of sin yourself. If they're too old to correct, then they're old enough to be independent and to be withdrawn from and not to be at home anymore. So back to the child in regard to their parents. What is the special relationship a child sustains to the parent? Well, they're commanded to obey their parents, Colossians 3 and verse 20, in all things. But as we said before, that wouldn't prohibit withdrawal because Ephesians 6:1 says that children are to obey their parents in the Lord. So there are some circumstances where a child is not to obey their parent. If their parent says, now don't you withdraw from me, well, that child is to obey their parents, but only in the Lord. That parent's telling them to do something that is not right. Now, I understand, again, if we're talking about a child that is dependent and still at home, they don't have the ability to withdraw themselves from that parent. They're dependent upon that parent. I'm not talking about this relationship. I'm talking about a child that may be in their teenage years, and here's this parent who's left the Lord and maybe left their family. And once they've left their family, what is that child's relationship to them? Well, the parent has withdrawn themselves in that particular way. And so if the parent's saying, hey, you still need to go shopping with me, you need to go to these games with me, you need to have this entertainment with me, and I'm going to have my girlfriend with me, and you need to come along, that child is to withdraw from that. And the command to obey is qualified by Ephesians 6 and in verse 1. You say, well, but a child is to honor their parent. Yes, absolutely. Ephesians chapter 6 and in verse 2, he tells children there, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with promise. Matthew 15 and verse 4, honor your father and your mother. But what does that word honor mean? Does that prohibit a withdrawal of fellowship? W. Vine says that the word honor means primarily a valuing. That's what it really means. It is to express one's value through respect for someone, strong to prize or to fix a valuation upon. So let's ask the question, can you value or esteem someone and still withdraw from them? Absolutely. The very reason, the very motive of discipline is the value of that person's soul. You know, in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in verse 1, he tells Timothy, do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father. That's value. That's honor. Then in verse 17, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor. But then in verses 19 through 20, those who are sinning, rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. That rebuke, remember he said, don't rebuke an older man, but entreat him as a father. But what about when these elders are sinning? There's the qualification. There's the exception. And honor does not prohibit. You can still honor that man and still withdraw from that person, still practice church discipline. Now, I will say that a child needs to be very, very careful in how they administer rebuke. You know, I believe that there's a situation where I could rebuke my father. There's a very different way that I'm going to rebuke my father than I am someone else. There is a certain reverence that God placed there with a child and their parent that is a training ground for their reverence to God. And this is not a license to leave that and to become disrespectful. Disrespect is not a part of church discipline. I want to emphasize that again. We can correct, we can admonish in a respectful way, and we can withdraw from someone with tenderness, with kindness, and with respect, but still say, I am sorry, but I cannot keep company with you. We can be respectful and do that. So no, this responsibility of honor is not something that would prohibit that. I want you to think about a real world application. You have a responsibility to honor your parents, even after you've left the home. Honor your parents. That's what Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 15. But even with that responsibility to honor your parents, what if your parents were committing a crime? Now, I mean, this may sound hard for us to even imagine, but let's say that your parent, let's say your father, was in the act of kidnapping someone. Would you have the right to apprehend them and to bring about their arrest and their incarceration? And if they were in the act of kidnapping someone and they were arrested and you were involved in that and they were incarcerated, it would probably be for most of the rest of their life. That's a very serious crime. And let me tell you, you would withdraw from that person. They would be withdrawn from you. There would be no social interaction. Would that mean that you're no longer honoring them? Absolutely not. You're to honor your parent, but there are some circumstances where there is a responsibility that we have to prevent a crime or to stop someone from doing something that's wrong. One parent is about to murder the other parent. You would have a responsibility to involve yourself in that. So my point is this, that all this argument about, well, you know, you've got to honor your parents and withdrawing wouldn't be honoring them, then what about arresting them? What about being involved in their incarceration? Is that dishonor? No, that's not dishonor. That is following through with the responsibility that you have. It's not necessarily disrespectful. It is simply doing the right thing at that particular time. So honor does not prevent a child from withdrawing from their parent. Honor does not prohibit this. A social relationship like shopping together or football games or hunting together or playing tennis together. These social things are not required of a parent and a child in order to be righteous. You do not have to eat Thanksgiving dinner with your parents or your kids. If they live in town and you won't eat with them, something's probably wrong. I understand that. But what I'm saying is, if you are separated by many, many miles and you don't eat that dinner together, you're not necessarily being unrighteous. So simply not eating with someone is not in and of itself wrong. You know, we think about a situation like just out in with those who are not Christians. You know, if I had a father-in-law who was not a Christian, I would have a relationship with him, one where I would show honor. But if he was a drunk, an alcoholic who was drunk every time my family was around, I would have every right to choose to end social relationship with him in order to protect my family from his influence. And I feel certain that most of us would do that. If a young couple gets transferred to another country with their job and doesn't have the money to travel back, they have not sinned. What we need to understand is, when we're talking about a special relationship between parents and children, there is a certain principle concerning parents and children. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus lays this out. In Matthew chapter 10 and in verses 34 through 37, he said, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." Jesus is saying there will come times where being loyal to the Lord is going to separate you from parents or children. That is as clear as it can be. The same thing is said in Luke 12, 51 through 53. Remember in Mark chapter 3, in verse 31, Jesus' brothers and mother came standing outside. They sent to him calling. And the multitude said, "Look, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." And in Mark 3 and in verse 33, he said, "Who is my mother and my brothers?" He looked around in a circle at those who sat about him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God is my brother, my sister, and mother." What's the principle? The principle is that our family in the Lord and our relationship with the Lord is higher and greater, preeminent and priority to the relationship that we have to our physical family. It doesn't mean that we're to dishonor them. It doesn't mean that we're to be disrespectful to them. But it does mean that our relationship with God takes priority over any special relationship we have with our parents or our children. It means that our relationship to our family in the Lord takes priority over our relationship to our parents or our children. And there's going to be a rare circumstance where it would even affect that, but this certainly would be one. But you know, here's another thing that we need to realize. I had people telling Jennifer, and when I would argue on her behalf, they would tell me, "Well, Brett, it's fine if you feel like you need to withdraw from a family member. That's fine. That's your prerogative. But you can't say that we have to, because there's a special relationship here that says that we don't have to." Well, I want you to think through that. A special relationship carries a special obligation. And those special obligations are not a matter of choice. Like we just saw in 1 Corinthians 7 in verses 1 through 5, the husband and the wife and their intimacy is not a matter of choice. They have a special relationship and there is a special obligation. The parent doesn't have a choice. The dad doesn't have a choice to provide or not provide for his family. The mother doesn't have a choice to love or not love her children. The special relationship carries a special obligation. And if there's a special relationship that prohibits withdrawal, then it's a sin to do it. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, "Well, it's okay if you feel like you need to do it, but I don't think I have to because of a special relationship." Well, if you're right and there is a special relationship that excuses one from withdrawal, then that special relationship would prohibit it. And it'd be sinful for me to do it. There's not a special relationship that is required of us that would prohibit it. You know, somebody says, "Well, Brett, how could I ever do this? How would I be able to accomplish this?" Well, I realize this is a very difficult thing, but I want you to remember in Matthew 19 and verse 26, with God, all things are possible. With God, all things are possible. And remember Genesis 22. God told Abraham to take his son, his only son, Isaac, to take him up on the mountain and to take his life. And that's exactly what Abraham left and did. God stayed his hand. You know, we find ourselves in that. We've got to remember this isn't the first time God has commanded something like this, and that's far more extreme. Abraham was willing to do it, and God said, according to James, now I know. Abraham manifested that God, he loved the Lord his God with all his heart, mind, and soul. We may be tested in that way. We may go through that. But I want to tell you that God's grace is sufficient for us. He will provide for us, and we can get through that. Well, that brings this study to a close. As Jesse mentioned, we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end of the next hour. You may have some questions about this, and I'm not saying I can answer every question, but what I hope I've laid out is really the foundation of that relationship and the fact that family members are to withdraw. But any questions that you have, you can bring those out at the end of the next hour. We're going to take about 10 minutes, so that means we'll come back here at 10:35, and we'll get started with the next hour. Appreciate your kind attention.